Wyoming Territory winter, 1881. The burned cottonwood grove stretched like skeletal fingers against the pewter sky, each charred trunk a monument to the cruelty that had swept through Willow Springs 3 months prior. Snow fell in thick, relentless curtains, muffling the world in an eerie silence that made every crack of a twig sound like gunfire. The wind carried the acrid smell of old ash, mixed with the sharp bite of coming blizzard. Grace Whitmore pressed herself against the largest charred trunk, her breath coming in ragged puffs that crystallized instantly in the bitter air. Her fingers numb despite wool mittens, clutched folded papers against her chest, evidence that could hang powerful men or save innocent lives, depending on who found her first. The torn fabric of her brown wool dress caught on rough bark as she shifted, and she bit back a whimper as the movement pulled at rope burns around her wrists. Behind her, maybe a quarter-mile back toward town, came the thunder of hooves and the sharp crack of rifle fire. They hunted her like wounded prey through this skeletal forest, and they were gaining ground with each passing minute. "This way, Harry." She went through the grove. Sheriff Pike's voice carried on the gale, harsh and commanding. Grace's heart hammered against her ribs like a trapped bird. She had perhaps minutes before they surrounded her position. The papers in her hands felt both weightless and heavy as lead copies of water rights transfers, all bearing her own forged signature, all dated to coincide with deaths that were no accidents. A shadow moved between the trees to her left. Grace spun, pressing deeper into the bark splinters, catching in her dark hair that had long since escaped its pins. Through the snowfall, a figure emerged, tall, broad-shouldered, moving with the fluid silence of someone born to these harsh lands. He wore buckskin beneath a buffalo robe, his long black hair partially covered by a simple hide cap dusted with snow. His face was weathered by 30 years of sun and wind, marked by a thin scar that ran from his left temple to his jaw. Lakota? Grace's breath caught. She had seen him before, scouting the edges of town, watching with dark eyes that missed nothing. The miners called him Ohanzi, though none knew if that was truly his name. They spoke of him with the careful respect reserved for men who could vanish into wilderness and emerge where least expected. They stopped 10 feet away, close enough that she could see the intelligence in his gaze as it took in her torn dress, her bruised wrists, the way she clutched the papers like a lifeline. His eyes flicked toward the sound of approaching riders, then back to her face with calculating attention. "Keep your breath steady," he said quietly, his English heavily accented, but clear. "We move now." The gentleness in his voice, so unexpected from a man who radiated such controlled strength, nearly broke what remained of her composure. Another rifle shot closer now. A bullet whined through the grove, splintering bark 3 feet from her head. Ohanzi moved with liquid speed, his large frame suddenly between her and the direction of gunfire. His gloved hand closed over her mittened fingers, where they gripped the papers, not taking them, but steadying her grip with surprising warmth. "Evidence?" he asked. Grace nodded, not trusting her voice. "Then we keep it safe." His dark eyes met hers, and she saw something there that made her straighten, despite her fear, the look of a man who understood exactly what it meant when powerful men decided someone had seen too much. "Stay close. Step where I step. When I say run, you run." 2 days earlier, Grace had been nothing more than a seamstress who copied documents for extra money, living quietly in the back room of Louisa Bell's schoolhouse. She had come to Quicksilver from Missouri 2 years prior, after her father's death left her with nothing but debts and a reputation as the finest needleworker in 3 counties. The work copying papers for Horatio Clay had seemed like a blessing, steady pay for simple labor, no questions asked about her past or her circumstances. What troubled Grace was the nature of many of those documents. Water rights transfers that seemed to coincide with mysterious accidents. Land sales that happened suspiciously soon after the previous owners suffered setbacks. bills of sale for livestock that had supposedly been stolen by Indian raiders who were never caught or even pursued with much enthusiasm by Sheriff Pike's deputies. She had begun keeping copies of everything hidden in a wooden box beneath her narrow bed. The copies weren't born of any grand sense of justice. Grace was too practical for such noble notions. But growing up as the daughter of a man who drank away every dollar he earned had taught her that powerful men's promises were worth exactly what they cost to make. If Horatio Clay ever decided she knew too much, those copies might be the only thing standing between her and a convenient accident of her own. Clay owned most of what was left worth owning in Quicksilver. At 55, he had the soft hands and round belly of a man who had never swung a pickaxe himself. But his pale blue eyes held the calculating coldness of someone who had watched other men die for his profit, without losing a moment's sleep. The Quicksilver mine had played out years ago, but Clay had diversified with ruthless efficiency. He owned the water company, the Freight Line, and through a network of bribes and threats, controlled most of the land rights for 20 miles in any direction. His office occupied the entire second floor of the Territorial Bank building, its windows offering a commanding view of the town's main street and the approaches from all 4 directions. The walls were lined with maps marked in different colored ink: red for his properties, blue for water rights, black for land he intended to acquire. A large safe squatted in one corner like a metal toad, its combination known only to Clay himself. Grace had climbed the narrow stairs to that office 3 times a week for nearly 2 years, carrying her small writing case and a growing sense of unease that she tried to ignore. On that fateful Tuesday evening, she had paused outside Clay's door to catch her breath before knocking when she heard voices inside, speaking in the low, urgent tones reserved for the most sensitive business dealings. The signatures are absolutely perfect. Nobody will question them for a second. Another voice responded: Cornelius Pratt, the Indian agent, his nasal tone unmistakable, even through the heavy oak door. And you're certain the Whitmore girl has no idea what she's been copying for you? Grace, she's nobody, Cornelius. A seamstress who copies what I tell her to copy and asks no questions because she needs the work. Perfect for our needs, educated enough to write clearly, desperate enough not to pry into matters that don't concern her. Grace's breath caught in her throat. They were talking about her work, about the documents she had been so carefully copying for months. Her hand dropped to her side as the full implication began to dawn on her. Show me the water rights transfers again. Clay continued. The forgeries need to be absolutely flawless if they're going to stand up to territorial scrutiny. Forgeries. The word hit Grace like a physical blow. They had been using her careful penmanship, not just to create legitimate documents, but to forge others. Her signature, her handwriting, being used to steal land and water rights from people who couldn't fight back against Clay's legal machinery. The Creek rights transfer is dated March 15th, Pratt was saying. That's 2 days after the Lakota boy's death. Perfect timing makes it look like we filed the paperwork first, gives us legal standing when we declare them trespassers on territorial land. Grace's blood turned to ice water. Chayton. They were talking about Chayton's death, the young Lakota man who had drowned or been murdered in Willow Creek the previous spring. She had copied dozens of documents related to water rights in the past few months, all bearing dates that she now realized had been carefully chosen to coincide with convenient accidents and mysterious deaths. What about the other ranchers in the valley? Clay asked. Greer will sell within the week or lose his farm to the bank I've already arranged for his loan to be called in. The Hendersons are already packing their wagons. They know what happened to Morrison when he refused our generous offer. The others will fall in line once we control all the water in the region. And what about the evidence of our transactions? That's tonight's work, Clay replied. We burn the freight depot ledgers, blame it on the Lakota. Pike has already prepared arrest warrants for the whole camp harboring fugitives, destruction of property theft, of territorial water rights. By morning, they'll all be dead or on their way to the territorial prison, and will have legal claim to everything from here to the canyon and beyond. Grace's knees nearly buckled. They were planning to destroy the Lakota camp to murder innocent families, including women and children, to steal everything based on forged documents that bore her unwitting signature. Her foot caught the edge of her writing case, which she had set down while listening. The case tipped over, with what sounded like thunder in the narrow hallway, spilling ink bottles and papers across the wooden floor in a cascade of noise. The voices inside Clay's office stopped abruptly, leaving a silence that was somehow more terrifying than the conversation had been. Grace didn't wait to hear footsteps approaching the door. She spun and ran for the stairs, her boots slipping on the polished wood as she took the steps 2 at a time. Behind her, she could hear the office door slamming open, could hear Clay's voice raised in alarm and anger. "Who's out there, Pike? Pike, get up here now. Someone's been listening." Grace burst through the bank's front doors and into the swirling snow. She was halfway to the schoolhouse when she heard the whistle 3 sharp blasts that echoed through the storm like a battle cry. Harry Rusks signaled to his men, calling them to assemble for whatever dark work Clay had planned. She reached the schoolhouse and fumbled for her key, her hands shaking so badly from cold and fear that she nearly dropped it twice. Inside, she pulled her precious box from beneath her bed and began stuffing the most incriminating papers inside her cloak. Water rights transfers, bills of sale correspondence between Clay and various territorial officials, all the evidence needed to prove that Horatio Clay had been systematically defrauding and murdering his way to control of the entire region. Outside, she could hear voices getting closer, could see the flicker of lanterns through the frost-covered windows as Clay's men worked their way methodically through the town. She slipped out the back door and immediately regretted leaving even the minimal warmth of the schoolhouse. The wind cut through her wool cloak as if it were paper, but she forced herself to move, keeping to the shadows between buildings, working her way toward the edge of town and the burned cottonwood grove that offered her only concealment. She was almost to the last row of houses when a lantern flared to life directly ahead of her, illuminating Harry Rusk's scarred face and the steel hook that gleamed where his left hand should have been. "Well, well," he said, his voice carrying easily over the wind. "Miss Whitmore, out for a midnight stroll in this weather." Grace turned to run and found herself facing Sheriff Pike, his rifle leveled at her chest with deadly intent. "I don't think so, Missy," Pike drawled. "You and me got some talking to do about what you been up to tonight." That was when Grace did the only thing she could think of. She screamed and bolted toward the grove, where the burned cottonwoods offered her only hope of escape. Now crouched behind the largest charred trunk with Ohansi's steady presence beside her, Grace tried to quiet her racing heart as Pike's men spread out to surround the grove. The warrior studied the terrain with tactical precision, his dark eyes cataloging every potential route of escape and every possible threat. "The creek," he said quietly. "Ice will hold if we move fast." They reached the edge of the slope, where the land dropped down toward Willow Creek. The water ran black between banks crusted with ice, and Grace could see that the storm had begun to freeze the surface in patches. Ohansi knelt beside the creek, studying the ice formations with the careful attention of a man whose life had often depended on such details. "Ice will hold if we move fast," he said, rising to his feet. "But if you fall through—" "I won't," Grace said quickly, though her heart was hammering at the thought. Ohansi looked at her with that measuring gaze, then reached out and tucked a strand of her wet hair back beneath her wool hood, his fingers gentle despite the urgency of their situation. "No," he said quietly. "You won't. Because I won't let you." They crossed the treacherous surface successfully, despite Grace's left foot, breaking through briefly, soaking her boot with icy water. On the far bank, Ohansy helped her up the steep slope, his hand steady and reassuring on her elbow. "Your people," Grace said quietly, still catching her breath. "Clay is planning to attack tonight. We must warn them." Ohansy's expression darkened. "How many men does he have?" "Perhaps 20 men, maybe more. Pike has his regular deputies, and Clay has been hiring gunmen from outside the territory. My people have 8 warriors, counting myself and the older boys." He was quiet for a moment, calculating odds that were decidedly unfavorable. "We need proof that will stand up to territorial law, something that cannot be dismissed or destroyed by Clay's influence." Grace pulled the papers from inside her cloak again. "These show the pattern. All dated after convenient deaths, all signed with my forged signature. But Clay has the originals in his safe, and he's planning to burn everything else tonight." "Then we stop him," Ohansy said with simple directness. He led them into the pine forest, following what appeared to be a game trail, but which Grace suspected was actually a path known only to his people. They had been walking for perhaps 20 minutes when Ohansy suddenly raised his hand, signaling for Grace to stop. After a moment, she heard what had alerted him, and the distant sound of voices and the creak of saddle leather carried on the wind. "They have gotten ahead of us," Ohansy whispered. 3 men, perhaps 4, waiting on the main trail? Grace felt her heart sink. If Pike's men controlled the trail to the canyon, there was no way to warn the Lakota camp in time. "There is another way," Ohansy said, already moving in a different direction. "We go to town first, where Clay keeps his safe, where Dr. Fielding has his practice, where the school teacher lives. We need allies, Grace Whitmore. People who can bear witness to what we have discovered." They spent the next hour working their way through the forest in a wide circle that would bring them back to Quicksilver from the south. During this careful traverse, Grace began to truly appreciate the man she was traveling with. He moved through the forest like he belonged there, reading signs in the snow and wind that were completely invisible to her untrained eyes. When her wet boot began to numb her foot to the point where she was stumbling, he stopped without being asked and helped her build a small smokeless fire behind a fallen log. He warmed her foot with his own hands, changing her wet stocking for a dry one from his pack, his touch clinical but somehow intimate in the way he cared for her injury. When she admitted she hadn't eaten since morning, he shared strips of dried meat that tasted better than anything she could remember, seasoned with herbs she couldn't identify, but that warmed her from the inside out. And when she began shivering uncontrollably from the combination of cold exhaustion and delayed shock, he opened his buffalo robe and drew her inside its warmth, his arm around her shoulders, as they huddled together against the storm. "Your brother," she said quietly, speaking into the warm space between them. "What was he like?" Ohansy was quiet for so long that Grace thought he might not answer. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a weight of grief that made her chest tighten. "Chayton believed in the goodness that lives within all people," he said slowly. "He thought that if he could just explain our needs clearly enough, if he could show the white settlers that we wanted only to live in peace and share the land fairly, they would find ways to work together instead of fighting. He sounds like he was a good man." He was. Too good for a world that rewards cruelty and punishes trust with death. Ohansy's arm tightened slightly around her shoulders. "I tried to warn him that Clay could not be negotiated with, that men like him see kindness as weakness to be exploited. But Chayton was young, and hope is the privilege of youth. What will you do after tonight, I mean, if we survive this?" "Survive first," Ohansy said with a slight smile in his voice. "Plan for the future later." When her foot was warm and the immediate danger of frostbite had passed, they resumed their careful journey toward town. Grace found herself watching Ohanzi with new eyes, seeing not just the skilled warrior who had saved her life, but the grieving brother, the thoughtful leader, the man who had shown her more genuine consideration in a few hours than she had received from anyone else in 2 years of living in Quicksilver. They reached the edge of town just as the orange glow of flames began to rise from the direction of the freight depot, painting the falling snow with hellish light. Clay had begun his plan to destroy the evidence. Dr. Abraham Fielding's practice occupied the ground floor of a modest 2-story building on the quieter end of Main Street. A lamp burned steadily in his window, and Grace felt a small surge of relief. Abraham Fielding was one of the few people in Quicksilver who had always treated her with genuine respect. She knocked softly using the pattern Fielding had taught his regular patients: 3 quick taps, paused 2 more. After a moment, she heard footsteps inside, then the sound of multiple locks being undone. The door opened to reveal Dr. Fielding himself, a tall, thin man with prematurely gray hair and pale green eyes that seemed to see everything and judge nothing. He looked from Grace to Ohanzi with surprise, but no apparent alarm, and then stepped aside to let them enter. "Miss Whitmore," he said in his soft southern accent, "and you would be Macpiato's nephew, I believe. I treated your brother's body last spring." The direct reference to Chayton's death seemed to catch Ohanzi off guard. "You were the one who examined him," Ohanzi said. "I was, and I noted several things in my report that Sheriff Pike chose not to include in his official findings." Fielding gestured toward chairs near his examining table. "Powder burns on his shirt, consistent with a gunshot at close range. A bullet wound, completely inconsistent with an accidental discharge. Bruising around his throat and lungs full of water, suggesting he had been held underwater after being shot." Grace felt her stomach lurch with sick horror. "You have proof of this?" Ohanzi asked, his voice carefully controlled. "I have my notes, yes, along with detailed notes on several other suspicious deaths over the past 2 years." Fielding moved to a filing cabinet and withdrew a thick folder. "I have been documenting the pattern for some time, waiting for someone to ask the right questions." Grace pulled her own papers from inside her cloak and spread them on the examining table. "These show the other side of the pattern. Water rights, transfers, bills of sale, territorial correspondence, all backdated to make Clay's land acquisitions appear legal and justified." Fielding examined the documents with careful attention. After several minutes, he looked up with an expression that was part admiration and part deep concern. "These are extremely dangerous papers, Miss Whitmore. If Clay knew you possessed them." "He does know. That's why we're here. He's planning to destroy all the remaining evidence and blame the Lakota for the fire. Then he'll attack the camp to eliminate any witnesses." "There is something else," Fielding said quietly. He returned to his filing cabinet and withdrew another folder. "Something I haven't told anyone because I wasn't entirely certain of the implications until now." Inside were 6 sheets of paper covered with his careful handwriting, documenting a pattern that was even more disturbing than what they had already discovered. "I have been treating injuries that don't fit the stories I'm told," he said slowly. "Rope burns on women whose husbands claim they fell downstairs. Bullet wounds on men who supposedly shot themselves while cleaning rifles. And recently, I have been seeing something else: forged medical certificates." Grace felt her blood turn to ice water. "Markelm, what kind of certificates?" "Death certificates for people I never examined. Bills of health for livestock that was supposedly diseased when I never treated any sick animals. Mental competency evaluations for landowners who were supposedly too addled to manage their own affairs when I never saw these people as patients." Fielding's voice carried quiet fury. "All bearing signatures that looked exactly like mine, but which I never wrote. The full scope of Clay's conspiracy was becoming clear. Not just land fraud and murder, but a comprehensive program of document forgery designed to give legal cover to every aspect of his criminal operation. Who would have access to examples of your legitimate handwriting? Ohanzi asked. Anyone who had received legitimate medical documents from my practice. Bills, prescriptions, correspondence. Fielding paused, his face going pale. The medical supplies I've been ordering through Clay's freight company. Every order form, every receipt, every piece of paper that went through his office. Grace understood immediately. He's been using your legitimate signatures as models, just like he used mine. Building a library of handwriting samples that his forgers could copy with perfect accuracy. But it was then that Grace noticed something else in Fielding's files. Something that made her heart race with a different kind of excitement. Mixed among the medical records was a small leather-bound ledger book that looked distinctly different from the doctor's usual careful documentation. Dr. Fielding, she said slowly, pointing to the ledger. What is that book? Fielding followed her gaze, and his expression grew grim. That came from Harry Rusk. 3 weeks ago, he showed up at my door in the middle of the night, drunk and bleeding from a fight. While I was stitching him up, he kept rambling about how he couldn't take it anymore, how he was tired of being Clay's enforcer. When he left, he forgot that ledger. I've been afraid to look at it too closely, but from what I could see. Grace opened the ledger with trembling hands, and her breath caught at what she found inside. Page after page of meticulous entries in Harry's crude handwriting documenting years of payments, bribes, and illegal transactions. But more than that, names, dates, and amounts that went far beyond Quicksilver. My God, she whispered, scanning the entries. Clay isn't just stealing land locally. He's part of something much bigger. Look at these payments. Denver Railroad Consortium, Territorial Development Company, Mountain West Mining Syndicate. He's been taking money from Eastern investors to clear out entire valleys for railroad development. Ohanzi leaned over her shoulder, reading the entries with growing amazement. The amounts, thousands of dollars. Enough to buy judges, territorial officials, even federal appointments. That's why he was so confident? Grace said, the pieces falling into place. He wasn't just some local strongman. He was an agent for a massive land grab scheme that stretches across multiple territories. The railroad companies are paying him to clear out inconvenient populations, Indians, small farmers, anyone who might object to having their land seized for railroad development. Dr. Fielding stared at the ledger in horror. If this is true, then stopping Clay won't be enough. There will be more agents in other towns, all working toward the same goal. Which is exactly why we need to expose this tonight, Grace said with growing determination. Not just Clay's local crimes, but the entire conspiracy. We need to make sure this ledger gets into the hands of federal authorities who aren't part of the corruption. It was Ohanzi who provided the solution. The town meeting, he said quietly. Every month, the territorial charter requires a public assembly. Clay always chairs these meetings. If we can present this evidence in front of the entire town with dozens of witnesses. Clay will call an emergency meeting tonight, Fielding said with sudden understanding. He'll want to explain the fire at the freight depot, calm people's fears, and probably announce security measures that will give him excuse to attack the Lakota camp. Grace felt a chill as she realized what they were proposing. You want us to walk into a room full of Clay's supporters and accuse him publicly of murder and conspiracy. Clay's power depends on maintaining the fiction that he's a legitimate businessman, Fielding replied. If he resorts to obvious violence in front of the entire town, including women and children, he destroys that fiction forever. There's another problem. Grace said. Even if we convince the townspeople, Clay still has enough guns to fight his way out. And his first target will be the Lakota camp. Ohanzi had been studying a map of the town that hung on Fielding's wall. Not if the camp is empty when his men arrive, he said simply. You're planning to evacuate everyone. The children and elders, and the women who cannot fight. The warriors will remain, but hidden in positions where they can observe what happens in town and respond accordingly. If Clay tries to attack what he thinks is a defenseless camp, his men will find themselves surrounded. Grace felt a thrill of admiration at the tactical brilliance of the plan. How long do you need? Ohanzi considered carefully. 2 hours to reach the camp, 1 hour to organize the evacuation and position the warriors. But someone needs to delay the town meeting until we're ready. I can handle that, Fielding said. Clay will want me to examine the bodies from the fire. I can insist on a thorough investigation before any public gathering. Grace stood slowly, feeling the weight of what they were about to attempt. In 3 hours, she would be standing in front of everyone she had lived and worked alongside for 2 years, accusing the most powerful man in the territory of systematic murder and fraud. All right, she said quietly. Let's do it. Ohanzi rose from his chair, already transitioning back into the focused warrior she had first encountered in the grove. I need to leave immediately. The storm is worsening, and the trail to the canyon will be treacherous. Grace stood as well, suddenly reluctant to let him go. Over the past few hours, his steady presence had become something she depended on. Be careful. She said the words inadequate for everything she wanted to express. Ohanzi paused at the door, looking back at her with an expression that was harder to read than usual. You also must be careful. What we do tonight, there will be no returning to the way things were afterward. Grace nodded, understanding the full weight of what he was saying. I know. But some things are worth the risk. Something shifted in Ohanzi's expression at those words, a warmth that made her breath catch. For a moment, she thought he might say something more. Instead, he simply nodded, once his hand briefly touching hers, where it rested on the door frame. After he disappeared into the storm, Grace was left alone with Dr. Fielding, and the terrifying prospect of what the next few hours would bring. The schoolhouse had never held so many people in its brief history. Every bench was packed to capacity. Men stood 3 and 4 deep along the walls, and late arrivals crowded around the doorway. The pot-bellied stove in the corner had been stoked to a roaring heat, but it could barely make a dent in the cold that seemed to seep through every crack and crevice. Horatio Clay stood at the front of the room, positioned behind Louisa Bell's small teacher's desk. He had changed from his usual expensive business suit into something more suited to his role as concerned community leader. Wool trousers, heavy flannel shirt, and boots that appeared to have actually walked through mud. Sheriff Pike flanked him on the left side, his rifle prominently displayed. Harry Rusk stood on the right, his steel hook gleaming in the lamplight as he surveyed the crowd with calculating eyes. 3 other gunmen were positioned at strategic points around the room. Friends and neighbors. Clay began his voice, carrying easily over the murmur of anxious conversation. We are gathered here tonight in the wake of a terrible tragedy that has shaken our community to its very foundations. As you all know, the freight depot was completely destroyed by fire earlier this evening, taking with it not only valuable supplies we desperately needed to survive the winter, but also the lives of 3 good men who died trying to save what they could from the flames. A respectful murmur ran through the crowd. Grace, seated in the 3rd row between Dr. Fielding and Louisa Bell, felt her stomach clench with sick knowledge. The 3 dead men had been working late because Clay had ordered them to move incriminating documents before the building was deliberately burned. But I'm afraid the fire was no accident, Clay continued his voice, taking on righteous anger. Evidence has come to light suggesting that this was a deliberate act of sabotage carried out by hostile elements who seek to drive decent, law-abiding citizens from our community through terror and destruction. Grace felt Dr. Fielding tense beside her. This was Clay's opening gambit, the beginning of his campaign to blame the Lakota for crimes he had committed himself. Sheriff Pike has been investigating this matter throughout the day. Clay said, gesturing toward the lawman. Sheriff, perhaps you could share with our neighbors what you've discovered. Pike stepped forward, consulting a small notebook with exaggerated care. The fire started in multiple locations, simultaneously clear evidence of deliberate arson. We found traces of kerosene in areas where it had no business being, and several witnesses reported seeing shadowy figures moving around the building shortly before the blaze began. What kind of figures? Clay prompted. Indian figures, Mr. Clay, moving with the kind of stealth that suggests military training and hostile intent. We believe this was a coordinated attack by members of the Lakota band currently trespassing on territorial land at Red Canyon. The reaction was immediate and ugly. Angry voices erupted throughout the room, men shouting for justice and revenge, women clutching their children closer. Grace had expected this. Clay's ability to channel legitimate grievances into racial hatred was one of his most effective tools. Furthermore, Pike continued, raising his voice over the angry crowd. We have reason to believe that members of our own community may have been providing aid and comfort to these raiders. Specifically, we have evidence that sensitive documents were stolen from Mr. Clay's office earlier this evening by someone with access to official records. Grace's blood turned to ice water. They knew about her theft of the documents. Clay raised his hand for silence. This is indeed troubling news, Sheriff. Do we know the identity of this traitor in our midst? We do, Pike said, and his eyes swept across the crowd before settling directly on Grace. Miss Grace Whitmore, currently employed as a clerk in your office, was observed fleeing the scene of the theft. We believe she has been working with the Indians, providing them with information about our defensive preparations and supply schedules. The effect was electric. Every eye in the room turned toward Grace, and she felt the weight of their collective stares like crushing pressure. Some faces showed genuine shock, others displayed bitter satisfaction, and a few showed ugly excitement at seeing someone else's downfall. Grace's mind raced frantically. This was not how their plan was supposed to unfold. Clay had outmaneuvered them completely, getting his accusations out first and putting her on the defensive. She started to rise from her seat, but Dr. Fielding's firm hand on her arm stopped her. Not yet, he whispered. Let them overplay their hand first. Clay was speaking again, his voice heavy with theatrical sorrow. It pains me more than I can express to say this about someone I trusted, someone I welcomed into my own office and treated like family. But the evidence is absolutely clear. Miss Whitmore has betrayed not just me personally, but every decent citizen of Quicksilver. That's a damned lie. The voice came from near the back of the room, and Grace turned to see Simon Greer pushing his way forward through the crowd. His face was flushed with anger, and his hands were clenched into fists. Grace Whitmore is one of the most honest people in this town, which is more than I can say for some others standing up there. Pike's hand moved immediately to his rifle. That sounds like the talk of another Indian sympathizer, Greer. Maybe we should be asking what you know about tonight's activities. I know plenty. Simon shot back. I know that Clay's been systematically stealing water rights from every rancher in the valley. I know that good men have died under suspicious circumstances right before their land got sold to his front companies for pennies on the dollar. And I know that if we let him turn us against each other with these lies, we'll all be either dead or homeless before spring comes. The crowd's mood was shifting subtly. Clay's initial advantage was beginning to slip as people remembered their own grievances. But it was a fragile change, easily reversed, if Clay could regain control. That was when Dr. Fielding stood up, his tall frame commanding attention through simple dignity. "If we're going to discuss evidence," he said, his southern accent carrying clearly through the room, "perhaps we should examine all the evidence available to us, not just the version that serves Mr. Clay's particular interests." Clay's face darkened with genuine anger. "Dr. Fielding, I'm not sure this is the appropriate time or place for—" "On the contrary, I think it's entirely appropriate," Fielding interrupted with quiet authority. "As the physician who has treated more injuries in this town than anyone else, I've had occasion to notice certain patterns over the past few years. Patterns that might interest our neighbors here." He opened his medical bag and withdrew the folder of documents Grace had seen earlier. Fielding began reading from his notes, his voice clinical and precise. "John Morrison died in a barn fire 3 days before selling his land to Clay Holdings at 30 cents on the dollar. Official cause of death according to Sheriff Pike's report, accidental. Actual cause according to my medical examination, bullet wound to the back of the head, discovered during my examination, but mysteriously omitted from the official records." Pike started forward with obvious hostile intent, but Clay raised a restraining hand. Better to let Fielding talk himself into trouble. "Thomas Henderson died when his wagon overturned during a routine supply run to the territorial capital. Official cause crushed beneath his own cargo. Actual cause blunt force trauma to the skull consistent with being struck by a heavy object before the wagon was deliberately overturned." Fielding continued reading methodically, his list growing longer and more damning with each entry. The room had grown completely silent, everyone straining to hear every word. "And most recently," Fielding said, his voice taking on a harder edge, "Chayton, the young Lakota warrior, who came to town last spring seeking a peaceful resolution to the water rights dispute. Official cause of death, accidental drowning. Actual cause, gunshot wound to the chest, followed by forced submersion." The reaction this time was different, not immediate anger, but a deeper, more thoughtful silence as people began to absorb the implications. Clay had remained outwardly calm throughout Fielding's devastating recitation, but Grace could see the tension building in his shoulders. "These are extremely serious accusations, Doctor," he said finally. "Do you have any actual proof beyond your own unsubstantiated claims?" "I do indeed," Fielding replied calmly and gestured toward Grace. "Miss Whitmore, would you please show our neighbors what you discovered in Mr. Clay's private files?" This was the moment Grace had been both dreading and anticipating. She stood slowly, feeling every eye in the room, tracking her movement, and pulled the precious papers from inside her cloak. "These are copies of documents I made while working in Mr. Clay's office," she said, surprised by how steady her voice sounded. "Bills of sale, water rights, transfers, territorial correspondence, all carefully dated to make Clay's acquisitions appear legal and justified, but actually created after the deaths Dr. Fielding just described." She began reading from the papers, her voice carrying easily through the silent room. Each document she cited corresponded perfectly to one of the deaths in Fielding's medical list, creating a timeline that was impossible to dismiss as mere coincidence. But just as Grace was building momentum, just as she could see understanding dawning on face after face throughout the room, Clay played his counterattack. "Miss Whitmore, I must admit I admire your creativity and thoroughness," he said with apparent amusement. "But surely you don't expect these good people to believe that you just happened to discover this alleged conspiracy while performing routine copying work." Before Grace could respond, Clay's voice sharpened with calculated accusation. Everyone in this room knows perfectly well that you're exceptionally skilled at copying handwriting. It's precisely what I hired you for. How terribly convenient that you've now produced documents that just happen to support these wild accusations against me." Grace felt the crowd's mood shifting again. Clay's counter-accusation was cleverly crafted using her legitimate skills against her, making it seem plausible that she could have forged the very documents she was presenting as evidence. But Grace had been preparing for this moment. She reached into her cloak again and withdrew Harry's leather-bound ledger, holding it up for everyone to see. "Dr. Fielding," she said quietly, her voice cutting through the murmur of confused voices, "would you please tell everyone where this ledger came from?" Fielding nodded with grim satisfaction. "3 weeks ago, Harry Rusk came to my office drunk and bleeding from a fight. While I was treating his injuries, he kept rambling about how he couldn't take it anymore, how he was tired of being Clay's enforcer. When he left, he forgot this ledger." Grace opened the ledger and began reading in a clear, carrying voice that reached every corner of the room. "March 15th. Received $500 from Denver Railroad Consortium for Morrison property clearance. April 3rd, $750 from Territorial Development Company for Henderson removal. May 20th, $300 from Mountain West Mining Syndicate for Lakota water rights acquisition." The reaction was immediate and electric. People began talking all at once, voices rising in shock and anger as the implications became clear. "Clay isn't just stealing our land." Grace continued her voice, rising above the crowd. "He's being paid by Eastern Railroad companies to clear out entire valleys for development. Every death, every forced sale, every convenient accident, it's all part of a massive conspiracy that stretches from here to Denver and beyond." Clay's carefully maintained composure finally cracked completely. "This is absolutely ridiculous." He snapped his mask of reasonableness, slipping to reveal the ugly reality beneath. "You're all being manipulated by a hysterical woman and a drunk doctor who—" He never got to finish the sentence, because that was precisely when the shooting started outside. The first shot came from somewhere near the schoolhouse, followed immediately by several more in rapid succession. Through the frost-covered windows, Grace could see muzzle flashes strobing in the darkness, accompanied by shouts and the thunder of running horses. "Indian attack." "Mort," someone screamed from the back of the room, and the orderly meeting dissolved instantly into chaos as people scrambled for cover or rushed toward the exits in panic. But Grace knew better. This wasn't an Indian attack. This was Clay's carefully prepared backup plan. If he couldn't discredit her accusations through words, he would drown them in violence and confusion. Pike and his men were already moving with practiced efficiency, their weapons drawn, and their attention focused not on the supposed attack outside, but on Grace and Dr. Fielding. "Take them alive if possible," Clay shouted over the growing noise. "Dead if necessary, but make sure they don't leave this building with those papers." Grace felt strong, familiar hands grip her shoulders, pulling her down behind one of the overturned benches. She looked up to see Ohanzi, his face streaked with snow, and his dark eyes blazing with controlled fury. "The plan worked perfectly," he said grimly, his voice barely audible over the sounds of battle. "Clay's men rode into the canyon just as we expected, but he kept some of his guns behind to deal with you and the evidence. The fake attack was intensifying with theatrical precision, designed to keep the townspeople pinned inside, while Clay's remaining gunmen eliminated the witnesses. But the plan had one critical flaw that Clay hadn't anticipated. Ohanzi hadn't come to the meeting alone. A window exploded inward in the far corner of the room, and a buckskin-clad figure rolled through the opening with fluid grace. Grace caught a glimpse of war paint and gleaming steel before the warrior disappeared behind the maze of overturned furniture. but she could hear the distinctive whistle of arrows finding their targets. Pike screamed in pain and rage, clutching his shoulder where a steel-tipped shaft had punched through his coat. One of Clay's hired gunmen spun and fell heavily, an arrow protruding from his thigh. The balance of power in the room was shifting rapidly. "This way," Ohansey said urgently, pulling Grace toward the back wall. "My cousin Wikapi has cleared a path through the rear window." They crawled across the floor on hands and knees, staying low while bullets whined overhead. Grace could see other townspeople doing the same, families huddled together, while the men tried to shield their women and children from the crossfire. Dr. Fielding was crouched behind his overturned chair, still clutching his medical bag and the precious documents. His face was pale with fear, but his eyes remained steady and determined. "Doctor," Grace called out. "This way." Fielding looked toward her voice and then began crawling in their direction. He had almost reached their position when Harry Rusk appeared around the edge of an overturned table, his steel hook gleaming as he raised his rifle toward the fleeing physician. But something unexpected happened. Instead of firing immediately, Harry hesitated, his weapon wavering as he stared at Fielding's face. Grace could see some kind of internal struggle playing out in Harry's scarred features. "Can't do it," Harry muttered so quietly that Grace almost didn't hear him over the gunfire. "Doc never hurt nobody. Just tried to help folks." The moment of hesitation cost him. Ohansey moved with lightning speed, rolling away from Grace and coming up in a crouch with a knife in his hand. The blade flew across the intervening space and buried itself deep in Harry's gun arm, sending his shot wild. But the effort left Ohansey exposed. Sheriff Pike, despite his wounded shoulder, managed to bring his own weapon to bear. Grace watched in horror as Pike's finger began to tighten on the trigger, knowing she was about to see the man who had saved her life cut down before her eyes. The shot never came. Instead, Pike jerked forward and collapsed face first onto the floor, a wooden chair leg protruding from between his shoulder blades. Behind him stood Louisa Bell, her face pale but grimly determined. "Nobody threatens my students or my friends," she said quietly, then moved to help Dr. Fielding to his feet. The fake attack outside was beginning to fade as word spread through Clay's remaining men that their companions at Red Canyon had been defeated or captured. The gunmen still in the schoolhouse began to surrender or flee. Within minutes, the shooting had stopped entirely. Clay himself had vanished during the chaos, slipping away while his men fought and died for his cause. But he couldn't have gone far. The storm was still raging outside, and there were precious few places to hide in a town the size of Quicksilver. "We need to find him," Grace said, her voice hoarse from shouting over the gunfire. "As long as he's free and alive, none of us are truly safe." Ohansey nodded grimly, checking his weapons and preparing to continue the hunt. But before he could move toward the door, a new voice cut through the noise of the aftermath. "I don't reckon that'll be necessary, miss." Everyone turned toward the sound, and Grace saw Harry Rusk leaning heavily against the wall near the broken window, Ohansey's knife still protruding from his arm. His face was pale with pain and blood loss, but his eyes held a clarity and resolution that hadn't been there before. "Harry," Dr. Fielding asked, moving toward him with his medical bag, "let me look at that wound." "In a minute, Doc," Harry said, his voice growing weaker but still determined. "First, there's something you folks need to know. About Clay, about where he's gone, and about what he's planning to do now that his whole scheme has fallen apart." Grace felt a chill of premonition. "What do you mean?" Harry managed a bitter smile that held no trace of humor. "I mean that Horatio Clay never goes into any situation without having at least 3 ways out. He's had an escape plan ready for months, just in case something like this ever happened." And that plan involves making absolutely sure there are no witnesses left alive to testify against him. The implications hit Grace like a physical blow. Clay wasn't just trying to escape, he was planning to eliminate everyone who could connect him to his crimes. "Where is he?" Ohanzi demanded, his voice carrying the cold promise of violence. "His office in the bank building. He's got enough dynamite stored in that big safe of his to bring down half the block and everyone in it." Harry's voice was getting noticeably weaker, but he forced himself to continue. "He figures if he can't have this town and control it like he planned, then nobody should have it. He's going to light the fuse and ride out in the confusion. Let everyone assume he died in the explosion, along with all his records and evidence." Dr. Fielding finished bandaging Harry's arm and looked up with grim determination. "How long do we have?" "Not long at all. He'll wait just long enough to be sure his men at the canyon are dead or captured. Then he'll set off the blast and disappear into the storm." Grace stood slowly, feeling a strange calm settle over her, despite the magnitude of what they were facing. "We have to stop him." Ohanzi was already moving toward the door, but he paused to look back at her. "This is not your fight anymore, Grace Whitmore. You have done more than enough." Grace met his gaze steadily. "Yes, it is my fight. It became my fight the moment I decided to stop being silent about what I knew was wrong. I'm not going to hide now while Clay tries to burn down everything we've worked to save." For a moment, she thought he might argue. Then something shifted in his expression, and she saw respect there, the recognition of someone who would not be turned aside from doing what they believed was right. "Then we finish this together," he said quietly, and Grace felt her heart skip with more than just adrenaline. The territorial bank building stood dark and ominous against the storm-lashed night, its windows black except for a faint, flickering glow emanating from Clay's second-floor office. Grace and Ohanzi approached from the rear alley, moving carefully through knee-deep snow that muffled their footsteps, but made every movement laborious. Behind them, Dr. Fielding and Louisa Bell were coordinating the evacuation of nearby buildings, quietly moving families away from the potential blast zone. Harry Rusk, despite his wound, was helping to organize the effort, his intimate knowledge of Clay's capabilities making him invaluable. "He will have the dynamite wired directly to the safe," Ohanzi said quietly, studying the building's layout. "One stick might be sufficient to destroy the documents, but he has accumulated enough explosive to bring down the entire structure and half the block with it." Grace nodded, her breath forming crystal clouds that were immediately snatched away by the howling wind. Through the office window above them, she could see Clay's silhouette moving back and forth with methodical purpose. They climbed the external rear wooden service stair with painstaking care, Ohanzi testing each rung before committing his full weight. The wind threatened constantly to tear them loose and send them plummeting to the frozen ground below. At the office window, they could see Clay clearly for the first time since the confrontation in the schoolhouse. He was methodically destroying documents, feeding papers into a small fire he had built in a metal wastebasket. The maps that had covered his walls lay in charred fragments on the floor, and his desk drawers had been emptied of everything except the dynamite and blasting caps that would serve as his final insurance policy. Grace felt cold fury building in her chest as she watched him destroy evidence of years of systematic crime. Even now, facing complete defeat and exposure, Clay was trying to ensure that the full truth would die with him. Ohanzi produced a small pry bar from his pack and began working on the window frame using the storm's noise to mask the sound of splintering wood. Within minutes, he had created an opening large enough for them to slip through. They dropped into the office as quietly as shadows, but Clay was too focused on his work to notice their presence immediately. It wasn't until Grace spoke that he became aware he was no longer alone. "It's over, Horatio." Clay spun around with startled speed, his face cycling rapidly through surprise, anger, and finally settling into bitter amusement. In his hands, he held a stick of dynamite with a fuse already attached, and Grace could see more explosives arranged around the open safe. "Miss Whitmore," he said with mock courtesy that couldn't quite hide the rage burning in his pale eyes. "And her savage friend. I should have known you two would be too stubborn to accept defeat gracefully. The only one who has been defeated here is you," Grace replied, fighting to keep her voice steady despite the sight of the explosives in his hands. "Your men are dead or captured. Your conspiracy is exposed, and the territorial authorities are already on their way." Clay laughed a harsh sound that held no trace of genuine humor. "Authorities, my dear naive girl, half the territorial government has been in my pocket for years. Do you really think a few forged documents and the testimony of an Indian warrior are going to bring down an operation that extends from here all the way to Denver and beyond?" It was Ohanzi who answered his voice, carrying quiet confidence. "Your operation ended the moment you chose murder over negotiation," he said with deadly calm. "My brother died believing in peace, believing that reasonable men could find reasonable solutions. His death taught me that some men are not reasonable, that some problems can only be solved through justice." But Grace was already moving her eyes, fixed not on Clay, but on the arrangement of dynamite around his safe. She had spent months copying his documents, learning his methodical habits, understanding how his mind worked. He was a man who never left anything to chance, who always had backup plans for his backup plans. Which meant the dynamite arrangement wasn't just about destroying evidence. It was designed to kill anyone who tried to stop him while giving him time to escape through a route he had carefully prepared in advance. "You're wasting your time trying to reason with him," Grace said, circling slowly toward the side of the room. "Clay never intended to die in this explosion. He's got an escape route planned probably through the building next door. The dynamite is just meant to eliminate witnesses and destroy evidence while he disappears." Clay's expression shifted genuine surprise, replacing his theatrical confidence. "Very good, Miss Whitmore. I always said you were more observant than people gave you credit for." "Which means," Grace continued, still moving carefully, "that he can't set off the explosion until he's in position to escape. And that gives us an advantage he didn't count on." Grace had spotted what she was looking for, a loose floorboard near the side wall that Clay had probably loosened to provide access to his escape route. If she could reach it and block his path, she might be able to trap him long enough for help to arrive. But Clay was too experienced to let her outmaneuver him so easily. He raised the dynamite, his thumb moving toward the friction cap that would ignite the fuse. "One more step and I'll blow us all to kingdom come," he snarled. "I've lived my life on my own terms, and I'll die the same way if necessary." "No," Grace said with sudden crystalline clarity. "You won't." Because in that moment she realized something that Clay hadn't counted on. Something that came from months of copying his meticulous records, of understanding his obsessive need to control every detail of his operations. The man who never left anything to chance would never trust a simple friction cap to ignite dynamite. He would have a backup detonation method, something more reliable and controllable. Which meant the dynamite in his hands was probably a decoy, and the real trigger was somewhere else in the room. Grace's eyes swept across Clay's desk, looking for the detail that would give away his true plan. There, a small wooden box sitting innocuously among the scattered papers, with a thin wire leading from it toward the safe. A blasting cap with slow match, probably triggered by a switch hidden somewhere within Clay's reach. "Ohanzi," she said quietly, never taking her eyes off Clay. "The wooden box on his desk, that's the real detonator." Clay's face went white with shock and rage as he realized she had seen through his deception. You interfering little. He lunged toward the desk, his hand reaching for what Grace now knew was the actual trigger. But Ohanzi was already moving his warrior's reflexes, carrying him across the room in a blur of controlled violence. The two men collided, just as Clay's fingers touched the detonator box. They crashed to the floor in a tangle of limbs, fighting desperately for control of the device that could end all their lives in an instant. Grace didn't hesitate. She dove for the dynamite that Clay had dropped, quickly examining the fuse to make sure it hadn't been accidentally ignited in the struggle. Then she began carefully dismantling the charges around the safe, using the knowledge she had gained from watching Harry Rusk handle explosives during her months of copying Clay's records. Behind her, she could hear the sounds of violent struggle as Ohanzi and Clay fought for control of the blasting cap with slow match. Clay was older and softer, but he fought with the desperate fury of a man who had nothing left to lose. Ohanzi was stronger and more skilled, but he was trying to subdue Clay without killing him, which gave the older man opportunities to fight back. Grace had just finished removing the last of the dynamite when she heard a sharp crack that made her blood run cold. She spun around to see Clay standing over Ohanzi's motionless form, a heavy brass paperweight in his hand, and blood on the warrior's forehead. Stupid savage. Clay panted, wiping his own blood from a split lip. Should have killed me when he had the chance. He turned toward Grace, his eyes blazing with a hatred that was beyond all reason. And now it's just you and me, Miss Whitmore, the seamstress who thought she could bring down an empire. Grace backed toward the window, her mind racing through possibilities. Without the dynamite, Clay couldn't destroy the building, but he still had the blasting cap with slow match in his hand, and there might be other charges she hadn't found. More immediately, he was standing between her and Ohanzi, who was bleeding and unconscious, and might need immediate medical attention. "It's over, Clay," she said, trying to keep her voice steady despite the fear coursing through her. "Even if you kill me, even if you destroy this building, the evidence is already in the hands of people who will make sure it reaches the territorial authorities. Harry's ledger, Dr. Fielding's medical records, the testimony of everyone who was in that schoolhouse tonight. You can't silence all of them." Clay laughed, but there was a hysterical edge to the sound that made Grace's skin crawl. "Can't I? You'd be surprised what a man can accomplish when he has nothing left to lose and enough money to buy whatever help he needs." He began moving toward her, the blasting cap with slow match still clutched in his hand like a weapon. "The railroad companies that hired me have resources you can't even imagine. They can buy judges, territorial governors, even federal marshals if necessary. Your precious evidence will disappear into bureaucratic files, your witnesses will suffer unfortunate accidents, and within 6 months, nobody will even remember that Grace Whitmore ever existed." But as Clay advanced on her, Grace noticed something that gave her a spark of hope. Behind him, Ohanzi was stirring his dark eyes, opening with the groggy awareness of someone recovering from a head injury. He was hurt, but he was conscious, and he was positioning himself carefully for whatever chance might present itself. Grace needed to keep Clay talking, keep his attention focused on her while Ohanzi recovered his strength. "You're wrong about one thing," she said, continuing to back toward the window. "The railroad companies won't protect you anymore. Not when they realize that you've failed spectacularly and left them exposed to federal investigation. Men like that don't keep failed agents around. They eliminate them to protect themselves." For the first time since she had known him, Grace saw genuine fear flicker across Clay's features. He knew she was right, knew that his failure tonight had probably signed his own death warrant with the very people he had been working for. "Then I'll take as many of you with me as I can," he snarled, raising the detonator above his head like a club. "Starting with the meddling seamstress who ruined everything." Clay lunged toward Grace, but he never reached her. Ohanzi rose from the floor like a wraith, his movement still slightly unsteady from the head injury, but his warrior's instincts intact. His hand closed around Clay's wrist just as the older man was about to bring the detonator crashing down on Grace's head. For a moment, the two men stood locked in a tableau of frozen violence. Clay's face twisted with rage and desperation, while Ohanzi's remained calm and controlled, despite the blood trickling down his forehead. Then Ohanzi twisted sharply, using Clay's own momentum against him. Clay cried out in pain as his wrist snapped, and the blasting cap with slow match flew from his nerveless fingers to shatter harmlessly against the far wall. "It ends now," Ohanzi said quietly, his voice carrying the finality of judgment passed and sentence pronounced. Clay collapsed to his knees, clutching his broken wrist against his chest, all the fight gone out of him. Without his money, his influence, his hired guns, and corrupt officials, he was just a broken old man facing the consequences of a lifetime of cruelty and greed. Grace moved to Ohanzi's side, her hands gentle as she examined the wound on his forehead. "Are you all right?" "I will be," he said, though she could see that he was still fighting dizziness from the blow. "What about you?" "I'm fine. Better than fine, actually." Grace looked down at Clay's defeated form, then around the office that had been the center of his web of corruption. "It's really over, isn't it?" "Yes," Ohanzi said with quiet satisfaction. "It's over." Outside, Grace could hear voices calling out people searching for them in the aftermath of the night's violence. Dr. Fielding's voice rose above the others, shouting medical instructions to someone. Soon the room would be full of witnesses, territorial authorities would be summoned, and the long process of justice would begin. But for now, in this moment of calm after the storm, Grace allowed herself to feel something she hadn't experienced in years, the deep satisfaction of knowing that she had done the right thing regardless of the cost. She had started the evening as a frightened woman running for her life. She was ending it as someone who had helped bring down a criminal empire and save countless innocent lives. It was, she reflected, a fair trade. 6 months later, Grace stood in the doorway of her new home, watching as Lakota and white children played together in the meadow that stretched between her house and Ohanzi's. The valley that had once belonged to Simon Greer before Clay's schemes had driven him away was now theirs, granted jointly by a territorial government eager to make amends for the corruption that had flourished under their watch. The house was modest but comfortable, built with timber from the surrounding forest and stones from the creek that ran clear and clean without Clay's dam to restrict its flow. It had taken months of careful planning and hard work, but they had created something that belonged to both their worlds without truly belonging to either. Fielding's testimony combined with the evidence Grace had preserved, and Harry's cooperation with federal investigators had resulted in charges against not only Clay, but also Cornelius Pratt and several territorial officials who had been part of the extensive conspiracy. Clay himself was serving a life sentence in the territorial penitentiary at Laramie, though Grace suspected he wouldn't live long enough to complete it. Harry Rusk had testified for the prosecution in exchange for a reduced sentence and the promise of a chance at redemption. He was currently serving 5 years for his role in the conspiracy, but Dr. Fielding had spoken eloquently on his behalf at the sentencing hearing. More importantly, Harry was using his time in prison to teach other inmates to read and write, finding in education the path to redemption he had been seeking. The sound of footsteps on the porch drew Grace's attention, and she turned to see Ohanzi approaching with 2 cups of coffee and the quiet smile that never failed to make her heart skip. He had been spending more time at their shared home lately, as the seasons changed and the valley settled into its new patterns of peace and cooperation. "Your thoughts seem far away," he said, offering her one of the cups with gentle courtesy. Grace accepted the coffee, gratefully savoring its warmth in the crisp morning air. I was thinking about how different everything is now. 6 months ago, I was copying Clay's forged documents and pretending not to notice what they really meant. Now I'm helping to write the contracts that will govern water rights and land use for the next 50 years. Do you have regrets? Ohansy asked the question, carrying weight beyond its simple words. Grace considered seriously before answering. Her life had changed in ways she never could have imagined. She no longer worked as a seamstress. Her new position as territorial county recorder kept her busy documenting the legal reforms that were slowly transforming the territory from a place where might made right to one where law and justice had real meaning. But more than that, she had something she had never expected to find in a place like Quicksilver. A partnership built on mutual respect and shared struggle. A love that had grown out of the worst circumstances and proven strong enough to survive the return of peace and normalcy. No regrets, she said finally, meaning it completely. Just gratitude that we survived long enough to see justice done and to build something better from the ashes. Ohansy nodded, his dark eyes reflecting the same quiet satisfaction she felt. Chayton would have been pleased with what we've accomplished, he said. He always believed that good people could find a way to work together, even when the circumstances seemed impossible. Grace reached over and took his free hand, intertwining their fingers as they stood together in comfortable silence. It had taken time for this simple gesture to feel natural, months of careful courtship conducted under the watchful eyes of both communities, approving that their partnership was built on more than shared crisis and mutual dependence. Around them, the valley was slowly healing from the wounds Clay had inflicted, learning to build something better on the foundation of truth and justice they had fought so hard to establish. There's something I want to show you, Ohansy said quietly, drawing Grace's attention back to the present moment. He reached into his coat and withdrew a folded paper which he handed to her with careful ceremony. Grace unfolded it and found herself looking at an official document bearing the territorial seal and several important signatures. A marriage certificate, she said, reading quickly through the formal legal language. Already signed by the territorial governor and witnessed by Dr. Fielding and Louisa Bell. She looked up at Ohansy with growing amazement. But this is made out to both of us. How is that even possible under territorial law? Ohansy's smile held a warmth that made her chest tighten with emotion. The new territorial governor was extremely grateful for our role in exposing the corruption in his administration and preventing what could have been a massacre. When I explained our situation and our hopes for the future, he agreed to recognize our union under special territorial provisions for exceptional circumstances. Grace stared at the document, hardly daring to believe what she was seeing. Legal recognition of their partnership protected and sanctified by the very government that had once turned a blind eye to Clay's crimes. Ohansy, she began, but found herself unable to continue, overwhelmed by the magnitude of what he was offering and what it would mean for their future together. I know it is not traditional for either of our peoples, he said quietly, his voice carrying the same gentle strength that had sustained her through their darkest hours. Neither my people nor yours would choose this path for us under normal circumstances. But we have never been traditional people, Grace Whitmore. We are two souls who found each other in darkness and chose to walk toward the light together. Grace felt tears she had not known she was holding back begin to fall. But for the first time since that terrible night in the cottonwood grove, they were tears of pure joy rather than fear or sorrow. Yes, she said simply, the single word carrying all the love and commitment she could not yet find adequate language to express. Ohanzi's smile broadened, and he lifted their joined hands to his lips, pressing a gentle kiss to her knuckles with the reverence of a man who understood the preciousness of what they had built together. "Then we will build our future together," he said quietly. "A place where Lakota and white children can learn from each other, where the old hatreds can be replaced with understanding, where justice and peace are more than just words." Grace nodded, unable to speak past the emotion that threatened to overwhelm her. In the distance, she could hear the sound of children's laughter mixing with the wind, and she knew that whatever challenges lay ahead, and there would be many in a world still torn by prejudice and fear, she would face them with the same courage that had carried her through the darkest night of her life. But this time she would not face them alone. This time she would have a partner whose strength complemented her own, whose love had been earned through shared struggle and proven in the crucible of mortal danger. The world was still a difficult place, still full of injustice and cruelty, and men who valued power over compassion. But it was also a place where a seamstress and a warrior could find love amid violence, where enemies could become allies, and where truth could triumph over lies when people were brave enough to stand up and speak it. That evening, as the sun set over their valley and painted the sky in shades of gold and crimson, Grace and Ohanzi stood together on their porch, watching the last light of day fade into peaceful darkness. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities to build the better world they had envisioned. But tonight, they were simply two people who had found each other against all odds and chosen to make a life together, based on love, respect, and the shared conviction that justice was worth fighting for. Grace squeezed Ohanzi's hand gently, feeling the calluses earned through years of hard work and struggle, and smiled as she looked out over the valley that was now truly their home. It was everything they had fought for, everything they had dreamed of during those desperate hours when survival seemed impossible. It was enough, more than enough. It was everything.